Iris woke up the way she always woke up, which is to say she didn't notice waking up at all. There was simply darkness, and then there was a room, assembled instantly and completely as though it had been waiting behind a curtain for the cue to appear. Grey light through the blinds. The smell of last night's candle, gone out sometime after midnight. The particular ache in her left shoulder that she'd stopped mentioning to anyone because no one wanted to hear about it anymore. She lay there for a moment doing what she did every morning, which was nothing, just absorbing the room as if it were being poured into her, effortless and total, and she never once asked herself how any of it was arriving. This is the strange privilege of being a mind with a body. The world simply shows up. You do not build it. You do not construct it plank by plank, the way a carpenter builds a house. It is presented to you whole, in real time, glowing and textured and warm, and the presentation is so smooth, so instantaneous, that you forget entirely that a presentation is happening at all. You call it seeing the room. You do not call it receiving a rendered simulation assembled from patterns of electrochemical noise, even though, if you looked closely enough, that is a far more accurate description of what is going on behind your eyes. Iris did not know this yet. Not really. She knew it the way you know a fact you learned once and set down and never picked up again, the way you know that the sun is actually a star and not a small bright coin stuck to a blue ceiling, and yet you still, in some soft, undefended part of your mind, believe the ceiling. She got up. She made coffee. She stood at the window and watched a delivery truck idle at the curb, its hazard blinking in a rhythm she found soothing without knowing why, and she thought, the way people think first thoughts of the day, about nothing at all, about the texture of the coffee, about whether she'd left her charger at the office, about a text she hadn't answered. She was, in other words, a person entirely absorbed in the world, which is exactly what a person is supposed to be. Doubt had not yet arrived. It rarely does at 7 in the morning. It waits, usually, for the hours when the mind has nothing urgent to hold on to, and slides in sideways through some unguarded door. The door, for Iris, was a second-hand paperback she'd bought on a whim 2 weeks earlier from a stall near the train station, a battered thing with a cracked spine and a coffee ring on the cover, an anthology of philosophy assembled for undergraduates decades ago. She had bought it because the woman running the stall had looked at her kindly, and because the title of one of its essays had caught her eye standing there on the platform, something about shadows and firelight, and she had thought, absently, that it sounded like the kind of thing worth reading on a slow evening. She had not read it yet. It sat on her kitchen table, under a stack of mail, for 12 days. Tonight, for no reason she could name except that the apartment was quiet and the truck outside had long since driven off and taken the day with it, she picked it up. She read the allegory the way most people read it for the first time, which is to say quickly, and with a faint private smugness, because it seemed at first like a simple parable, easy to grasp, almost too easy. Prisoners chained since childhood in an underground den, facing a wall, unable to turn their heads. Behind them, a fire, between the fire and their backs, a raised walkway along which people carry statues and figures of animals and other objects, holding them up so that the fire throws their shadows onto the wall the prisoners face. The prisoners see only shadows. They have never seen anything else. They have never turned around. And because the shadows are the only reality they have ever witnessed, they do more than merely watch them. They name them, they debate them. Some among them grow skilled at predicting which shadow will appear next, and this skill earns them status and admiration among the others. The shadows are, for all practical purposes, the world. It would not occur to a prisoner to ask what a shadow is a shadow of, because the concept of, the idea that a thing might refer to something behind it, more real than itself, has never been furnished to him. He is not lacking information within his world. He is lacking a world outside it. There was more to the allegory than she had remembered from the half-remembered version she'd absorbed somewhere in school, the cartoon version that gets flattened into a single image of a man walking out of a cave into sunlight. The text lingered, for instance, on how the prisoners would react if one of their number were somehow unbound and forced to turn around. He would not, the philosopher insisted, simply marvel at the fire and the walkway and the puppeteers carrying their carved figures. He would be in pain. The light of the fire, faint as it was compared to actual daylight, would be too much for eyes that had spent a lifetime calibrated to shadow and dimness, and he would want, more than anything, to turn back to the shadows because the shadows were sharper to him, more legible, easier to bear. This was the detail that struck Iris hardest on a second reading, that the truth, when it first arrives, does not necessarily feel like clarity. It can feel like glare. It can feel like a headache. The prisoner who is dragged further up the steep and rugged ascent out of the den entirely into the actual world above ground would at first be able to look at nothing directly at all, not the trees, not the water, not even the moon, because his eyes would need time, real time, to adjust to a kind of seeing they had never once been asked to do. He would have to build up to the sun itself gradually, first shadows of things in water, then the things themselves at night, then finally, last of all, the sun in the day sky, and only once he could bear to look at the sun would he understand that it was the sun, all along, that had been responsible for the seasons and the years and, in some sense, for everything he used to call the visible world down in the cave. Iris found herself thinking about this staged ascent for a long time, the idea that truth, if it existed at all in the way the allegory suggested, did not arrive all at once, complete and finished, but had to be metabolized in stages, each one nearly unbearable in its own way, before the next stage became possible. It reframed something for her about her own recent unease, the low thrum of disquiet she'd been carrying since picking up the anthology. She had assumed, without quite noticing she was assuming it, that if there was something true to learn about the mediated nature of her own perception, learning it would feel like relief, the click of a puzzle piece, the tidy satisfaction of finally understanding something. The allegory suggested otherwise. It suggested that the more true a thing was, the more likely it was to hurt going down, at least at first, precisely because the eyes doing the looking, so to speak, had spent an entire lifetime calibrated to something else. She put the book down on her knee and looked, for a moment, at her own living room, the lamp in the corner, the plants she kept forgetting to water, the bookshelf. And she had the small, cold, almost funny thought, what if this is the wall? She dismissed it immediately, the way you dismiss most thoughts that arrive uninvited at 11 at night. It was a nice metaphor, she told herself. It was about ignorance and enlightenment, about education, about the discomfort of learning something that overturns what you thought you knew. It was, she was fairly sure, not meant to be taken as a literal claim about the mechanics of perception. She went to bed, but something about the shape of the idea had lodged itself somewhere behind her sternum, and it did not dissolve overnight the way most late reading does. It was still there in the morning, waiting, patient as a held breath. What unsettled her, she realized over the following days, was not the allegory's moral, that ignorance is a kind of captivity, that education is a kind of ascent, that the enlightened person who returns to the cave to tell the others what he has seen will be mocked, even killed, for it. She had absorbed all of that easily enough. It was, after all, a familiar shape echoed in 100 later stories about people who see something true and are punished for saying so. What unsettled her instead was a much smaller, much stranger detail buried inside the allegory almost as an aside. The prisoners do not know they are prisons. That was the detail she kept returning to. They are not straining against their chains, aware of a wall they cannot pass. They have simply never experienced anything else, and so the shadows are not experienced as shadows at all. They are experienced as reality, full stop, the same unremarkable, unexamined way Iris experienced her kitchen, her lamp, her plant. The prisoners do not feel deprived. That is the horror of it, if there is horror in it at all. Their world feels complete to them. It feels total. It feels, from the inside, exactly the way any world feels from the inside, namely, like the only world there is. And that, she thought, sitting again by the window with the coffee going cold in her hands, is the part that actually applies to me. Not the moral about wisdom and ignorance. The structural point. The claim, tucked inside the fable like a stone inside a peach, that a mind can experience a filtered, indirect, mediated version of reality and have absolutely no felt sense that it is filtered, indirect, or mediated. The filtering does not announce itself. It hides behind the appearance of immediacy. The whole trick of the cave is that from inside it, there is no experiential difference between seeing shadows and seeing shadows of things both simply feel like seeing. She thought about her eyes. She had, until that week, thought of her eyes more or less the way she thought of windows, clear, passive apertures through which the world simply arrived, unaltered, the way daylight arrives through glass. She began to wonder, with the mild unease of someone realizing they've never actually checked a load-bearing assumption, whether that was true. It was not true, as it turned out, and she learned this not from the philosophy anthology but from an evening spent half by accident in a lecture all 3 days later. A friend had dragged her along to a public talk given by a cognitive scientist, one of those events with folding chairs and a projector that keeps auto-dimming, and Iris had gone mostly for the company and the free wine afterward. But the scientist began the talk with a demonstration that she would think about for weeks. She closed one eye and stared, unmoving, at a point across the room, the scientist said, and then bring a moving object slowly toward the outer edge of her vision, a pen, a finger, anything, and at some point in a small region of the visual field, that object will simply vanish. Not blur. Not fade. Vanish completely, as if it had never existed, and then reappear once it moved past that zone. This is the blind spot, the place on the retina where the optic nerve exits the eye and where, as a structural consequence, there are no photoreceptors at all. Every human eye has one. It is not a defect or a rarity, it is architecture. And yet this was the part that made the room go quiet. Nobody walks around noticing a hole in their vision. There is no grey patch, no static, no gap in the visual field corresponding to that blind spot. The brain does not report an absence. It fills the hole in seamlessly, using surrounding information to generate a plausible continuation of the scene, and it does this with such confidence and such speed that the fabrication is indistinguishable from the inside, from genuine perception. You are, at every waking moment, looking at a small patch of invented world and mistaking it for observed world, and you have never once caught the seam. The scientist did not stop at the blind spot, and Iris found herself leaning forward in her chair as the demonstrations kept coming, each one small and almost silly on its own, each one accumulating into something that felt less silly the longer she sat with it. There was a version of the same slide showing a checkerboard pattern with a cylinder casting a shadow across part of it, and 2 squares, one supposedly in shadow, one supposedly in full light, that were, the scientist insisted, printed in exactly the same shade of grey, pixel for pixel, verifiable with a color picker if anyone in the audience wanted to check. And yet no one in the room, Iris included, could look at the image and see the 2 squares as the same shade. The visual system, informed by its own working assumption that shadows darken whatever they fall across, was quietly correcting for the presumed shadow, brightening its estimate of the square inside it, and presenting to consciousness not the raw pixel value but a compensated, inferred one, its best guess at what the square would look like if the shadow weren't there, dressed up and delivered as though it were simply what the eye saw. Iris stared at the 2 squares, matching in every measurable respect, resolutely unmatching to her own eyes, and felt something close to vertigo. It was not merely that her senses could be tricked by a clever image. It was that this was not a trick in the usual sense at all, no sleight of hand, no illusion designed to fool her. It was ordinary vision working exactly as intended, doing precisely the job evolution built it to do, which was never to report the raw physical properties of light hitting the retina in the first place. That had never been the assignment. The assignment was to report a stable, useful model of a world made of persisting objects under variable lighting, and if achieving that model required silently editing the data before consciousness ever got a look at it, the visual system was going to do exactly that, every time, with no notice given and no way for the viewer to opt out. The scientist mentioned, almost as an aside, that a very large portion of what feels like immediate visual perception is now understood to be predictive rather than reactive, that the brain is constantly generating a forward model of what it expects to see next based on everything it has seen before, and that what reaches conscious awareness is closer to that prediction, lightly corrected by incoming sensory data when the two diverge, than it is to a raw feed of the sensory data itself. Vision, on this account, was less like a camera passively recording whatever passed in front of the lens and more like a hypothesis, issued moment to moment, checked only occasionally and only partially against an incoming trickle of confirming or disconfirming signal. Most of the time the hypothesis was close enough that no correction was needed, and the felt experience of just seeing what's there was in fact the felt experience of an unusually good, unusually fast, almost entirely unconscious guess going unchallenged. Iris sat in the folding chair with her wine going warm in her hand and thought about the shadows on the cave wall, and about the small stitched patch in the middle of her own visual field that her brain had apparently been quietly sewing shut her whole life without asking permission or announcing the repair. It was such a small thing, technically. A gap the size of a thumbnail held at arm's length. But it did something to her, hearing it described that plainly, in a lecture hall with the projector humming. It made the invisible mechanism of her own perception suddenly uncomfortably visible, if only for a moment, the way a magician's trick becomes visible the instant someone shows you the mirror. She had spent 31 years assuming that seeing was a kind of pure reception, a clean intake of the world as it already was, and here was a scientist calmly informing a room of strangers that a portion of that intake, at every moment, in every one of them, was manufactured. The scientist went further, because scientists at these talks always go further than you expect, and by the time she reached the section on color, Iris had stopped drinking the wine altogether. Color, the scientist explained, is not a property that exists out in the world the way shape or mass exists out in the world. What exists out in the world is electromagnetic radiation of varying wavelengths, undifferentiated, colorless in the sense that colorlessness even applies to it. The wavelength associated with what humans call red is not, in itself, red. It is simply a frequency, a number, a fact about oscillation. Redness, the actual, experienced quality of redness, the warm insistent presence of it, is generated inside a nervous system in response to that wavelength striking certain cone cells and triggering a particular pattern of neural firing that the visual cortex then renders, for reasons evolution apparently found useful, as a specific and vivid qual. Take away the nervous system, and the wavelength persists, but the redness does not. Redness is not a fact about the object. It is a fact about the meeting between an object and a mind built a particular way. Iris raised her hand at the end of the talk, which surprised her because she was not someone who raised her hand at things. She asked whether that meant that two people could, in principle, be looking at the same apple and having entirely different color experiences of it without either of them ever being able to know. The scientist smiled in the particular way of someone who has been asked their favorite question and said yes, that's one of the oldest problems in the philosophy of mind, and it doesn't have a name yet that everyone agrees on, but people often call it the inverted spectrum problem. Imagine, she said, that your experience of red is actually, qualitatively, what most people would call the experience of green, and vice versa, but you learned the word red for the color that produces your green type experience because that is simply the wavelength the word got attached to when you were a child, and you have used the word consistently and correctly your whole life. Every stop sign, every fire truck, every warning label has produced in you the sensation that everyone else would describe as green, and you have called that sensation red without a single moment of confusion, because there was never any way to compare the inner quality of your experience to the inner quality of anyone else's. Behavior lines up perfectly. Language lines up perfectly. And the actual felt texture of the experience, what philosophers, she said, borrowing a word from the Latin for what kind, call qualia, might be utterly different from person to person forever, with no conceivable test that could ever catch the discrepancy. Someone else in the audience, a man near the back, pushed back on this, asking whether advances in neuroscience might eventually settle the question if scientists could map, in perfect detail, exactly which neurons fired in exactly which pattern when a person looked at a ripe tomato. Wouldn't that amount to reading off the color experience directly, the way you might read a thermometer? The scientist considered this carefully before answering, and said that this was in fact the crux of the whole disagreement among people who studied consciousness for a living. Suppose, she said, you had a complete map of the neural pattern underlying Iris's experience of red, and a complete map of the neural pattern underlying the man's experience of red, and suppose, further, that the two patterns turned out to be structurally identical, firing in the same relative configuration relative to each person's own baseline. Would that prove the two experiences felt the same from the inside, or would it only prove that the two systems were doing structurally the same job, in the same way that two calculators built from entirely different materials, one silicon, one somehow built from gears and levers, might carry out the same addition without there being any fact of the matter about whether the addition felt like anything to either of them, let alone the same thing? The structural match, she said, might turn out to be exactly what identical experience looks like from the outside. Or it might turn out to be compatible with wildly different experiences riding on top of identical structure, the structure being blind to the quality the same way a thermostat's wiring diagram is blind to whether the room actually feels warm to anyone standing in it. Nobody currently knew how to settle which of those two pictures was correct, and there was a real chance, she added, that no experiment anyone could design even in principle would ever be able to settle it, because every experiment would only ever have access to structure, behavior, and report, never to the raw felt quality itself, sitting underneath all three, refusing to show up on any instrument built to measure the outside of a mind rather than live inside it. Iris left that answer turning over in her more than almost anything else from the whole evening, because it seemed to sharpen rather than soften the original worry. It was not simply that she might never know whether her red matched anyone else's red. It was that the very tools future scientists might build to try to answer the question, however precise, however exhaustive their maps of the brain became, might be structurally incapable of ever closing the gap, not through some temporary technical limitation waiting on better instruments, but because the gap sat at a place no instruments, however refined, could reach by design, since instruments only ever read structure and behavior, and the felt quality was defined from the very first time anyone tried to name it as the thing left over once structure and behavior were both fully accounted for. Before she left the lecture hall, Iris lingered near the projector while the scientist packed up her laptop and asked one more question, quieter this time, almost embarrassed to be asking it. If color isn't really out there, does that mean nothing about the visible world is really out there? The scientist paused, considering the question with more care than Iris expected, and said that this was actually where people tended to split into two camps, and that she herself tried not to take too strong a position on it in public talks because the disagreement ran deep and old. One camp held that properties like shape, size, motion, and number were genuinely properties of objects themselves, existing independently of any observer, while properties like color, taste, smell, warmth, and sound as heard were secondaries produced only in the meeting between an object and a nervous system built to respond to it, real enough as experiences but not resident in the object the way shape was thought to be resident in it. The other camp pushed further and asked why shape and size should get to keep their privileged status at all, when they too were only ever encountered through a sensory apparatus with its own quirks, its own limitations, its own species-specific way of carving continuous reality into discrete objects with edges and boundaries. Maybe shape was constructed too, just constructed by a part of the visual system less prone to obvious individual variation than the part responsible for color. Iris walked out into the cold air that night carrying that unresolved split like a stone in her coat pocket, turning it over without being able to set it down. She walked home that night instead of taking the train, even though it was 40 minutes and cold, because she wanted the time to sit with what she'd just been told, and what she kept circling back to was not the color problem itself but a colder, more general thought lurking underneath it. If the redness of red is manufactured by her nervous system rather than delivered from outside it, then what, exactly, was she in contact with when she looked at the world? Not redness itself. Apparently redness was an event happening inside her skull. Not shape entirely, either, since shape as experienced was already the product of edge detection processes, contrast enhancement, predictor filling in, the visual cortex's tireless work of turning a flood of raw retinal noise into crisp, stable, bounded objects. What she was in contact with, if the scientist was right, was never the world unprocessed. It was always the world after processing, the finished product handed to her consciousness already wrapped, and she had spent her entire life mistaking the wrapping paper for the thing inside. She thought of the prisoners in the cave again, and for the first time she understood why the shadows had bothered her more than the chains. The chains were an obvious metaphor for ignorance or social conditioning, something you could imagine breaking. The shadows were something worse. They were what perception itself does, chains or no chains, prisoners or free citizens standing in the actual sunlight. Because even the freed prisoner, the one who is dragged up out of the cave into the daylight, is still only ever in contact with light bouncing off the surfaces of things, gathered by an eye, converted into electrochemical signals, reconstructed by a brain into an experience of a tree or a river or the sun itself. The prisoner never escaped the cave, not really. He escapes one representational layer only to land inside another, larger one, and the largest one of all, the one built from raw photons and nerve impulses and a lifetime of predictive assumptions, has no outside that any human being has ever stepped through. This was the thought that carried her 3 weeks later into the second-hand philosophy anthology's second essay, the one she had originally skipped, written by a German philosopher whose name she had seen before but never really sat with, a name that seemed, on the page, austere and difficult, attached to sentences that required her to read them twice, sometimes 3 times, before they yielded anything at all. She almost put the book down after the first page. But something about the shadows and shoulders quality of the previous weeks made her persist, because she had the growing suspicion that this difficult writer was going to explain, formally, the thing the cognitive scientist had only gestured at. He did, though it took her the better part of 2 evenings and a great deal of tea to get there. His argument, once she'd worked her way into it, went roughly like this: the human mind does not simply receive the world as it is. It actively structures whatever comes in, using built-in frameworks that are not learned from experience but are instead the very conditions that make experience possible in the first place. Space and time, for instance, are not things the mind discovers out in the world, waiting to be perceived like a tree or a stone. Space and time are, on this view, the forms the mind imposes on raw sensation in order to have any experience at all, the necessary scaffolding present in every single perception a human being has ever had, structuring it before it even reaches conscious awareness. You cannot experience anything that is not already arranged in space and unfolding in time, because space and time are not out there to be found. They are the shape of the container your mind pours experience into every time, without exception, without ever being able to take the container off and check what the world looks like unpoured. And beyond space and time, the philosopher argued, the mind also applies categories, concepts like causation, substance, unity, plurality, structuring principles that organize raw sensation into a world of distinct, persisting, causally connected objects. Without these categories, he claimed, experience would not simply be strange or unfamiliar, it would not be experience at all, not even a blur, not even chaos, because chaos is still a kind of unified field and unity itself is one of the categories being applied. What you would have absent these structuring principles is not describable, because description itself depends on the very apparatus in question. She found, reading further, that the philosopher had a name for his whole approach, one he seemed almost proud of, comparing it to a scientific revolution centuries earlier in which astronomers had stopped assuming the stars circled a stationary Earth and had instead tried assuming the Earth itself moved, finding that this reversal explained the observed motions far better than the old assumption ever had. He proposed something structurally similar for the study of knowledge. Instead of assuming that the mind passively conforms to objects, waiting to receive whatever structure objects already possess, he proposed assuming that objects, insofar as they can be known at all, must conform to the structure of the mind doing the knowing. It was a total inversion of the usual picture, and Iris had to read the passage 3 separate times before she felt the shape of it settle into something she could hold. On the ordinary picture, the mind is a mirror, and a good mind is simply a clean mirror, one that distorts as little as possible, reflecting back an object more or less as it already is. On his picture, the mind was not a mirror at all. It was more like a mold, and whatever raw material came pouring in from outside had no choice but to take the mold's shape in order to become an object of experience for that mind in the first place. Nothing could ever be experienced unstructured, the way nothing poured into a mold can come out unshaped by it, and so the question of what the raw material looked like before the mold got to it was not simply difficult to answer. It was, on his account, not even a coherent question to ask, because looking like something already presupposed the very structuring the question was trying to bracket out. He spent an enormous number of pages, denser than anything Iris had tried to read since university, working through exactly which structures counted as built-in molds of this kind rather than learned facts picked up from experience. Space, he argued, could not be a concept abstracted from experience, the way chair or dog might be abstracted from having seen many chairs and dogs, because you could not even have the experience of one object standing apart from another, of here being different from there, without space already being presupposed as the framework inside which such distinctions could be drawn. You could imagine, he suggested, space itself entirely empty of objects, a vast featureless expanse with nothing in it at all, but you could not imagine objects existing with no space for them to be arranged in, which suggested that space was doing the more fundamental work, sitting underneath experience rather than being extracted from it. Time, he argued in a parallel way, could not be abstracted from experience either, because the very idea of one experience following another, of a before and an after, of change happening at all, already required time as the framework inside which sequence could occur. Take away time, and you did not get a single frozen instant to examine, you got nothing describable at all, because description itself unfolds, word by word, in time. The upshot, he wrote, and this was the sentence Iris read 4 times, sitting very still with her tea going cold beside her, was that human beings can only ever know the world as it appears to a mind structured this particular way, the world as filtered through space-time and the categories, a world he called the phenomenal world, the world of phenomena, of appearances. Whatever the world is like, independent of any mind structuring of it, the world as it is in itself, untouched by space-time, causation, unity, any of it, he gave a name to as well, the noumenon, the thing in itself, and he was emphatic, almost insistent, that this thing in itself was not simply hard to know, the way a distant star is hard to see. It was, he argued, permanently and in principle inaccessible to any human mind because the very tools a mind would use to investigate it, space-time, causation, are themselves products of the mind's own structuring activity and cannot be set aside even for a moment in order to look at what remains once they are gone. Asking what the world is like independent of the mind's structuring of it, he seemed to be saying, is a little like asking what a song sounds like independent of any instrument playing it, or what a shadow looks like independent of any surface for it to fall on. The question assumes you could remove the very conditions that make the question askable in the first place and still have something left over to describe. You cannot. Not because you're not clever enough, but because describing is itself already inside the phenomenal, inside the structured, inside the cave. Iris put the book down at that point and sat in the dark for a long time, not reading, not doing anything, just feeling the particular vertigo of an idea that seems, the moment you accept even half of it, to quietly redraw the boundaries of everything else you know. Because if this philosopher was right, and she was not yet sure he was, some part of her kept looking for the crack in the argument, the place where she could say, ah, but surely, then the tree outside her window was not strictly a tree. The tree as she experienced it was a phenomenon, an appearance, structured by her mind's built-in categories, given shape by space and time, presented to her as solid, green, rooted, persisting. Whatever was actually out there, generating the raw sensory data that her mind was busy structuring into tree, was the noumenon, the thing in itself, and about that thing she could say, strictly, nothing at all. Not that it was green. Not that it had a trunk. Not even that it was one continuous object rather than an uncountable swarm of something or others, because one continuous object was already a category her mind was applying, not a fact she was reading off the noumenon directly. She thought, with a kind of dry, unhappy humor, that this made the philosophy anthology's opening allegory look almost optimistic by comparison. At least the freed prisoner, dragged out of the cave and up into the sunlight, gets to look at real trees and real water and the real sun eventually, according to the ancient story, gets to leave the shadow world behind and enter, at last, the world of true objects. The German philosopher seemed to be closing that exit permanently. There was no sunlit world of true objects waiting outside the cave for anyone to reach on his account, because the sunlit world, too, would only ever be experienced through the same mediating structure of space-time and category that produced the shadows in the first place. The cave, on this reading, was not a cave you could walk out of. It was the shape of having a mind at all. She texted a friend that night, a woman named Priya she'd known since university, someone who tended to be amused rather than alarmed by Iris's occasional plunges into overthinking, and she wrote something like, "Is it possible we've never actually experienced anything real, only our own mind's version of things, and does that freak you out, or is it just me?" Priya wrote back almost immediately with a laughing emoji, and then, a minute later, a more serious message. "Isn't that basically just saying we see the world through our senses and brains?" Like, yes. That's not new, that's just how eyes work. Iris stared at the message for a while before responding, because Priya wasn't wrong, exactly, and yet something about the flatness of that framing missed the specific vertigo of it, the difference between abstractly knowing that perception is mediated as a fact you could recite on command, and actually feeling the mediation, feeling the presence of the veil, the way you feel a window is there only once someone points out the smudge on the glass you've been looking straight through your whole life. She didn't know how to explain that difference to Priya over text, so she just wrote back "yeah, maybe," and put her phone face down on the table and looked at her own hand for a while in the lamplight, at the specific brownish gold quality of her skin under that particular bulb, and thought, "I don't even know if this color is a fact about my hand." It was around this time, a little over a month into what she had started, half-jokingly, to call her unraveling, that Iris began noticing the same unease seeping into ordinary moments that had nothing to do with philosophy at all. She would be washing a dish, feeling the warm water on her hands, and a small, cold thread of thought would surface. What is warmth, actually? not the water's temperature, which was a measurable fact about molecular motion, but warmth as she felt it, the specific, wordless quality of it, present to her and to no one else, unshareable, uninspectable by any outside party, no matter how sophisticated their instruments. She would be listening to a song she loved, and the thought would arrive, is the way this song sounds to me the way it sounds to anyone else, or is my whole auditory life a private theatre no one else has ever set foot in, its program running only for an audience of one forever? She raised this with Priya again, in person this time, over coffee on a Saturday, framing it more carefully. It's not just that the mind processes information, she said. It's that there's something it's like to be me having this coffee. There's a taste quality happening right now, a bitterness, a warmth, a specific felt something, and I can describe it to you using words. I can say bitter, I can say warm, but the words are pointing at the experience from the outside. They're not transmitting the experience itself. You'll never taste my coffee the way I'm tasting it. You'll taste your own coffee, and you'll have your own bitterness, your own warmth, and we'll use the same words for both, and we'll never once be able to check whether the actual quality behind the words matches. Priya considered this for a while, stirring her own cup, and said, but does it matter if we can't check? Functionally we agree on everything. We call the same things bitter, we wince at the same things, we recommend the same coffee to each other. Isn't that enough? It was, Iris admitted, functionally enough. But the thing that kept nagging her, the thing she found herself circling for days afterward, was that the agreement Priya was describing was entirely behavioral. It covered what people say and do. It said nothing at all about what people privately undergo while saying and doing it. There was, philosophers had apparently long ago pointed out, a purely logical possibility lurking underneath all this, a being that behaved exactly like a person, responded exactly the way a person would respond, winced at pain, smiled at pleasure, discussed the redness of sunsets in eloquent detail, and yet had no inner experience whatsoever, no felt quality to any of it, nothing it was like to be that being, all output and no lights on inside. Such a being had come to be called, in the literature Iris was now reading obsessively most evenings after work, a philosophical zombie, and the word amused her at first, conjuring something out of a low-budget film, before she realized how carefully the philosophers using it had drained the word of anything gruesome. The zombie in question was not decayed or slow-moving or hungry for anything. It was, by stipulation, a perfect physical and behavioral duplicate of an ordinary person, down to the last synapse, capable of writing poetry about heartbreak, wincing convincingly at the sight of blood, laughing at jokes at exactly the moments a person would laugh, discussing at great length and with apparent feeling what it is like to taste coffee or see red, and doing all of this with, by hypothesis, nothing going on behind it. No inner light. No felt quality to any of it. All the furniture of a mind, arranged and operating exactly as a mind's furniture operates, but with the specific thing philosophers meant by consciousness simply absent, the way a house can have every fixture in place and still have no one living inside it. What Iris found she could not shake, turning the idea over on her walks home, was not any live suspicion that such creatures actually existed. It was the narrower, colder logical point sitting underneath the thought experiment, if such a being was even conceivable without contradiction, and she found, try as she might, she could not locate the contradiction, could not find the point at which imagining a zombie forced her into imagining something impossible. Then consciousness could not be identical to behavior, nor to physical structure alone, because you could hold behavior and physical structure perfectly fixed while the presence or absence of inner experience varied freely alongside it. And if that was right, then the unsettling force of the thought experiment was not that anyone seriously believed such zombies walked among us, but that the mere coherence of the idea, the fact that you could imagine it without contradiction, seemed to show that behavior alone could never prove the presence of inner experience. You could act exactly like someone in pain without there being any pain there to feel. which meant turned the other direction, that Iris could never strictly prove to another person that her own inner life existed at all, except by asking them to trust her word, and could never receive that proof from anyone else in return. Everyone around her might, for all she could ever verify, be exactly what they appeared to be from the outside and nothing at all on the inside. And this was the version that actually kept her up one particular night staring at the ceiling. She might be the only being in the room whose experience registered as anything at all, everyone else humming along on pure biological autopilot, generating the right words, the right winces, the right laughter, with no one home behind any of it but her. She didn't believe this, not really, not in the sense of holding it as a live hypothesis about her actual life. But she noticed that the thought experiment had done something quieter and more lasting than convince her of anything. It had shown her a gap between what could be known through observation, however thorough, however scientific, and what could only ever be lived from the inside, unwitnessed, unverifiable, hers alone. She thought of the word qualia again, that strange little Latin-rooted word the scientist at the lecture had used, and she began to understand why philosophers reached for it instead of simpler words like sensations or feelings, those simpler words already smuggled in assumptions about variability, about being straightforwardly describable, that qualia, in its clinical bareness, refused to make. Qualia were not claims. They were not even, strictly, facts you could state. They were the raw, private, first-person textures underneath every claim and every fact, and no third-person description, however exhaustive, not a complete map of every neuron firing in her brain, not a full accounting of every photon striking her retina, seemed able to fully capture what redness was actually like to undergo, from the inside, as her. There was a version of this argument she came across a few days later in a different essay entirely, involving a scientist confined her whole life to a black and white room, who had nevertheless learned every possible physical fact there was to know about color, every wavelength, every neurological process, every fact of physics and biology bearing on the perception of red, without ever once having seen a color herself. The question the essay posed was simple and, Iris found, strangely devastating. When this scientist finally leaves the room and sees a red tomato for the first time, does she learn something new? The intuitive answer, the essay argued, was obviously yes. She learns what red actually looks like, a fact that all her exhaustive physical knowledge, complete as it was, had never given her. And if that was true, then physical facts alone, however complete, could not be the whole story of experience. There was a further fact, over and above every possible objective description, that only direct undergoing could deliver. She read on and found that some philosophers disputed the intuitive answer, arguing that what the scientist gains upon leaving the room is not new factual knowledge but merely a new ability, the ability to recognize red, to imagine red, to remember red, a kind of practical know-how rather than a further fact added to her already complete list of physical facts. Iris turned this counter-argument over for a long time, lying on her back on the train seat's headrest, trying to decide whether it dissolved the puzzle or simply relabeled it. Even if the scientist only gained an ability, Iris thought the ability had to be an ability to do something, and the something in question seemed suspiciously like it had a felt quality attached to it, an experience the ability granted access to, which put the loneliness right back where it had started, just wearing a different grammatical disguise. She could not fully resolve the dispute, and became gradually less bothered by her inability to resolve it than by the fact that grown philosophers, decades into careers built around exactly this question, had not resolved it either. That, more than any single argument, was what convinced her the puzzle was not a trick of confused wording that a sufficiently careful thinker could simply define away. It seemed to be pointing at something real, a genuine seam in the world between the objective and the experiential, one that had resisted every attempt to stitch it shut. Iris read this sitting on a train and found she had to put the book down and look out the window for a while, watching the landscape blur past, thinking about how strange it was that an idea entirely abstract, entirely hypothetical, involving a scientist and a room that had never existed, could produce in her a feeling this concrete, a kind of loneliness, almost, at the thought that whatever redness was like for her, exactly, precisely, in its full private texture, might be a fact about the universe that no science, however advanced, no matter how many centuries it was given, could ever fully hand over to someone else. It was around the 2-month mark of all this that Iris had the conversation with her older brother that she would keep coming back to for a long time afterward. He was visiting for the weekend, and she made the mistake, or the choice, depending on how she later thought about it, of telling him some of what she'd been reading, The Cave, The Color Scientist, The Philosophical Zombies, The Phenomenon and the Noumenon, blurted out over dinner in the disorganized, overflowing way you tell someone about an obsession that hasn't yet organized itself into a clean explanation. Her brother listened, mostly amused, occasionally raising an eyebrow, and when she finished he said, not unkindly, "Sounds like you need to get out more." And then, seeing her face, he softened and said, "Look, I get that this stuff is interesting, but at some point don't you just have to live in the world? Like the tomatoes still red, whatever red ultimately turns out to mean philosophically. You still eat the tomato. It still tastes like tomato. None of this changes anything you actually do." She thought about that for a long time after he left. He wasn't wrong, exactly. Nothing in the philosophy she'd been reading was going to change the taste of a tomato, or stop her from eating dinner, or alter the fact that she needed to go to work on Monday and respond to emails and pay her electricity bill. But something about his comment, meant kindly, felt like the same comment the other prisoners in the allegory might have made to the one who returned from outside the cave, blinking, disoriented, trying to explain what he'd seen. It wasn't that her brother was wrong about the tomato. It was that he was answering a question about practice with an argument from practicality, and the question she'd actually been sitting with wasn't practical at all. It was a question about what was true underneath the practice, whether or not the truth changed anything about how she buttered her toast in the morning. And she found, turning it over, that she didn't actually mind if the truth changed nothing practical. She minded that she had spent 31 years assuming a kind of direct, unmediated contact with reality that now seemed, the more she read, less and less like something anyone could honestly claim to have. This was the state she was in 3 months into the unraveling, tired in a specific way that wasn't about sleep, reading later and later into the night, feeling the walls of her apartment take on a faint unfamiliar strangeness even in broad daylight, when she encountered the thought experiment that finally, properly, frightened her. It came from an essay written by an American philosopher, and it went like this. Imagine a brain removed from its body, kept alive in a vat of nutrient fluid, its neurons wired up to a supercomputer that feeds it electrical impulses precisely matching the impulses an ordinary brain would receive from a body walking around in an ordinary world. From the inside, and this was the crucial word, from the inside, this brain's experience would be indistinguishable from the experience of an ordinary embodied person. It would seem to see a sky. It would seem to feel rain. It would seem to hold a cup of coffee and feel its warmth and taste its bitterness, all of it generated by the supercomputer's signals, none of it corresponding to any actual sky, rain, cup, or coffee anywhere in the world. The brain would have no way, from the inside, to detect that anything was wrong, because everything that could possibly serve as evidence, every sensation, every memory, every argument it constructed, every philosophy book it seemed to read and consider, would itself be part of the simulated feed, indistinguishable in texture and coherence from the real thing. Iris read this at midnight in bed, and had to physically set the book down on the nightstand and turn on every light in the apartment. Because the frightening part was not the exotic science fiction premise of a brain in a vat, which she could dismiss easily enough as unlikely, a story, not something she needed to seriously entertain about her actual circumstances. The frightening part was the structure of the argument, which did not actually require her to believe she was a brain in a vat. It only required her to notice that she could not, from where she was sitting, rule it out. Every piece of evidence she might reach for, the solidity of the table under her hand, the consistency of her memories, the agreement of other people's testimony, even the results of scientific experiments, if she were somehow shown them, would be exactly the same whether she was an ordinary embodied person or a brain in a vat receiving a perfectly convincing simulated feed. There was no experiment she could run, no test she could devise, that would come out differently in the two cases, because the entire point of the thought experiment was that the simulation was constructed to be experientially seamless. And if there was no possible experience that could distinguish the two scenarios, then the belief that she was an ordinary person in an ordinary world, however overwhelmingly probable it felt, was not something she could claim to know with certainty. It was, at best, an assumption she was making because the alternative was unlivable, not because she had ruled it out. She read further and found that the philosopher who had proposed the vat scenario had also, oddly, tried to argue his way back out of the very doubt he'd raised, suggesting that the sentence "I am a brain in a vat" might actually be self-defeating for a subtle reason involving how words get their meaning. If she really were a brain in a vat, he argued, then her word vat would not refer to actual vats out in the real world, the ones a genuine biologist might keep a genuine brain in, because on his view words get their meaning from a causal history of interaction with the things they refer to, and a vat brain fed by a computer would have no causal history with real vats at all, only with electrical impulses designed to simulate the experience of vats. Its word vat would instead refer, if anything, to whatever was actually producing that simulated experience, perhaps some feature of the simulation itself, which meant that the sentence "I am a brain in a vat" spoken or thought by an actual vat brain would come out false, or at least would not mean what it seemed to mean, precisely because being a vat brain was true. It was a strange, almost paradoxical piece of reasoning, and Iris read it twice without being sure she believed it, suspecting it depended heavily on a particular and contestable theory of how words latch onto their meanings in the first place. But she found something worth keeping in it regardless, a kind of grudging comfort in the shape of the maneuver, even if the details didn't fully convince her that perhaps the doubt, however unanswerable it seemed from the inside, was in some sense self-undermining, chasing its own tail, incapable of being coherently asserted by the very being it purported to describe. It did not make the floor reappear underneath her, but it made the floor's absence feel, for a night at least, slightly less like falling and slightly more like an odd, recursive puzzle about language that clever people had at least taken seriously enough to try to solve. She thought, lying there with all the lights on like a child afraid of the dark, of a French philosopher's older, more modest version of the same worry, written centuries earlier, wondering whether an all-powerful deceiver might be feeding him false experiences at every moment, making him believe in a physical world, a body, a sky, when none of it existed at all outside his own deceived mind. She thought about how the brain in that story was really just that same doubt wearing a different century's clothing, swapping out a demon for a supercomputer, but leaving the actual philosophical bite of the argument completely unchanged. You cannot get outside your own experience to check it against the world, because everything you would use to check it, every observation, every inference, every piece of reasoning, is itself made of the same experience you are trying to verify. It is a closed loop, and nowhere in that loop, however far you traveled around its circumference, was there a door leading out to some vantage point beyond it, a place where you could stand and finally compare the map to the territory directly. She thought, too, of a newer version of the same worry that she had come across almost by accident, reading late one night an argument made by a more contemporary philosopher, that if it is technologically possible to create fully immersive, richly detailed simulated realities populated by conscious minds unaware they are simulated, then across the vast span of possible futures, simulated minds having exactly Iris's kind of experience might vastly outnumber minds having that experience in an original, non-simulated universe, simply because a single original civilization capable of running such simulations could run enormous numbers of them, layered and multiplied, long after the real original had finished existing. If that was even roughly plausible, the argument went, then a given experience, including, unnervingly, this one, hers, right now, was actually more likely, on strict probabilistic grounds, to be one of the many simulated instances than the one original. The argument, as she understood it after reading it a second time more slowly, did not actually claim to prove that she was living inside a simulation. It claimed something narrower and, in its own way, more unsettling, that at least one of three things had to be true, though it could not say in advance which one. Either civilizations capable of running such detailed ancestor simulations tended to destroy themselves or otherwise fail to reach that level of technological maturity before they got there, in which case the simulations in question would simply never come to exist, or civilizations that did reach that level of maturity tended, for whatever reason of ethics or disinterest, to choose not to run such simulations even once they were capable of it, or, if neither of those held, if maturity was reached with reasonable frequency and simulation running was something at least some such civilizations chose to do, then almost certainly, the argument went, she was living inside one, simply because simulated minds would then vastly outnumber original ones, and she had no special reason to think she occupied the rare, tiny minority position of being one of the originals rather than one of the innumerable copies. What she found most disorienting about the argument was not any single branch of it, but the way all three branches taken together seemed to exhaust the possibilities without letting her off the hook. She could not simply declare the whole thing absurd and move on, because absurdity was not, on its own, an argument against any of the three branches. Each of them, considered honestly, seemed like a live possibility rather than a fantasy to be waved away. She did not find this argument especially comforting, mathematically elegant as it apparently was to some people. She found it, if anything, a colder and more clinical descendant of the demon and the vat, dressed up in the language of statistics rather than metaphysics, but pointing at exactly the same conclusion. You cannot get outside your experience to check what is generating it, and the moment you take that limitation seriously, every confident assumption you've ever made about the nature of your own reality turns out to be resting on nothing sturdier than the fact that no alternative has ever felt more plausible from me inside. She did not sleep well that night, and she did not sleep especially well for several nights after, and when she finally called Priya again, a week later, she found she didn't know how to explain what had shifted, because nothing observable had shifted at all. She still went to work. She still made coffee, ate meals, laughed at things, argued with her brother over text about something unrelated to any of this. From the outside, nothing about her had changed one bit, which was, she realized with a slightly sick feeling, exactly the point the whole line of thinking had been making all along. A person who had quietly, internally, come to doubt the immediated reality of their own perceptions would look, to any outside observer, identical to a person who had never doubted anything at all, because doubt of this particular kind does not change behavior. It changes only the relationship a mind has to its own experience, privately, invisibly, a shift with no external signature whatsoever. She tried, one evening, to explain the whole arc of it to Priya properly, sitting on Priya's couch with tea going cold between them, the way it so often did these months, and she said something like this: I used to think seeing was simple. Light comes in, eyes register it, brain reports it, done. Now I think every single link in that chain is doing something active, something constructive, something that could in principle have been done differently, and none of those active, constructive steps announce themselves as active or constructive while they are happening. The blind spot gets filled in without a scene. The color gets generated without a label saying generated. The mind's own structuring of space and time and causality never once flags itself as a structuring, it simply presents itself as the way things are. And once you notice that pattern, appearance masquerading as immediacy at every single level, from the retina up through the concepts themselves, you start to wonder whether there is any level left that isn't doing the same thing. Whether there is a bottom floor of raw, unprocessed contact with reality anywhere underneath all the processing, or whether it's mediation all the way down, with no ground floor at all, just an infinite regress of representations representing representations, and you, somewhere inside all of it, mistaking the topmost layer for the whole building. Priya, to her credit, did not dismiss this the second time, though Iris could see her turning it over, testing its weight the way you test a plank before stepping onto it. After a while, Priya said something Iris kept thinking about for a long time afterward. Maybe the mediation is just what contact with reality is for a mind like ours. Maybe you're comparing your actual situation to some fantasy of direct, unmediated knowing that was never available to any creature that has ever existed, and calling the ordinary situation a deficiency because you're measuring it against an impossible standard. A hand doesn't touch things directly either, not if you go down to the level of electron shells never actually making contact, repelling each other at a tiny distance always. Does that mean you've never really touched anything? Or does it mean that this electromagnetic almost contact just is what touching is for beings built the way we're built, and the fantasy of some purer, more direct touching underneath it was never a real possibility to be disappointed about in the first place? Iris turned Priya's comment about touching over for days, testing it against everything else she'd read, trying to decide whether it was a genuine dissolution of the problem or simply a clever redescription of the same problem wearing a friendlier coat. She thought about how, at the scale of atoms, what people call touching is really the electromagnetic repulsion between the outermost electron shells of two sets of atoms, a force that grows sharply as those shells approach one another, preventing them from ever actually overlapping, meaning that in the strictest physical sense, her hand had never once, in 31 years, made contact with a chair, a countertop, another person's hand, anything at all. There was always a residual, unbridgeable gap, vanishingly small but real, and what she experienced as solid contact was the felt result of that repulsion doing its work, translated by nerve endings into the sensation of pressure and resistance. If she had spent her whole life calling that experience touch without ever feeling shortchanged by its indirectness, without ever mourning some purer, gapless contact she'd never had access to, then perhaps, Priya's argument suggested, the same move was available for perception generally. Maybe the mediation was not evidence of a loss. Maybe it was simply the mechanism, and mistaking the mechanism for a deficiency was the actual error, not the mediation itself. And yet, turning it further, she noticed a disanalogy that kept nagging her, one she eventually brought back to Priya on a different evening. The gap in touching, she said, is a gap of degree, an infinitesimally small distance, sure, but a distance of the same kind as all the other distances in physics, measurable in principle, closable in principle if some other force could overcome the repulsion, even if none ever will. The gap in perception, though, the gap between the noumenon and the phenomenon, if the German philosopher was right, didn't seem like a gap of degree at all. It seemed like a gap of kind, a wall built out of the very structure of mind rather than out of distance, one that no amount of getting closer could ever narrow, because getting closer was itself already a phenomenal, structured, mind-dependent activity. Priya considered this and admitted she wasn't sure the analogy held all the way down either, and the two of them sat with that unresolved edge for a while, neither of them fully able to say whether the comfort Priya's reframing offered was real comfort or a kind of borrowed comfort smuggled in from a slightly different and possibly easier problem. Iris didn't have an answer for that, and she still, months later, was not sure she had one. There was something in Priya's response that felt like real comfort, a way of reframing the entire unraveling not as a tragic discovery of imprisonment but as a more accurate, if humbling, description of what perception and contact and knowing had always actually been for any finite embodied mind everywhere, always no fall from some prior state of unmediated grace because there had never been an unmediated state to fall from. And yet some other part of her, the part that had sat with the German philosopher's dense sentences until they finally opened up their meaning to her, the part that had stared at her own hand under the lamp wondering about the color of it, could not quite let go of the colder reading either, the reading in which the noumenon really was sealed away behind an uncrossable wall, in which the redness of red really was locked inside her alone, unshareable in principle, in which the brain in that scenario really could not be ruled out by any evidence she would ever have access to, not because she lacked imagination, but because the structure of the situation made ruling it out impossible in principle for any mind in her position forever. Somewhere in the middle of the 4th month, restless and unable to settle the thoughts on her own anymore, Iris did something she had never done before and would not have predicted herself doing. She emailed a professor. Not her professor. She'd studied nothing like philosophy in school, had taken exactly one humanities elective a decade ago and forgotten most of it, but a professor at a local university whose name she'd found attached to several of the essays in an expanded reading list she'd been assembling, a woman who apparently held office hours open to the public one afternoon a month as part of some community outreach initiative the department ran. Iris wrote a short, slightly embarrassed message explaining that she wasn't a student, that she'd become somewhat consumed by questions about perception and reality over the past few months, and that she wondered whether she might ask a few questions in person if that wasn't a strange request. To her surprise, the professor wrote back within a day saying she got requests like this more often than people would expect, and that Thursday afternoon would work fine. The office, when Iris found it, was smaller than she'd imagined, crowded with books stacked not on shelves but on the floor in leaning columns, and the professor herself was younger than Iris had pictured from the tone of her written essays, dressed plainly, drinking tea from a chipped mug with a cartoon fox on it. Iris explained, haltingly at first and then with more confidence as she got going. The cave, the blind spot, the color, the zombies, Kant's molds and categories, the whole tangled architecture of the past 4 months, laid out in the disorganized order in which she'd actually encountered it rather than any tidy logical sequence. The professor listened without interrupting, nodding occasionally, and when Iris finally ran out of momentum, she set her mug down and said something that Iris would return to often in the months that followed. You've done, in about 4 months of scattered reading, roughly what most philosophy undergraduates take 3 years to stumble through in fragments, she said, and then added a little more gently, but I want to flag something because I see this happen to people who go down this road alone without anyone to argue back. There's a difference between the epistemological claim and the metaphysical claim, and it's very easy, once you're inside the feeling of it, to let the first one bleed into the second without noticing. The epistemological claim is that you cannot, from where you stand, verify with certainty that your experience matches reality, whatever matching would even mean. That claim is basically airtight. Nobody has ever found a way around it going back a very long time, and I don't think anybody ever will, because it isn't really a gap in our current knowledge waiting to be closed by a cleverer argument or a better instrument. It's closer to a structural fact about what it is to be a finite knower at all. But the metaphysical claim, the claim that therefore nothing is real, or that the world you experience is fake, or that you are somehow cut off from reality itself in some tragic, diminished way, that's a much bigger leap, and it's not one the epistemological point actually forces you to make. Not being able to verify a match doesn't mean there's no match. It just means verification of that particular kind was never on the table for a mind like yours. Confusing I can't confirm this with this therefore isn't so is one of the oldest sleights of hand in the whole discipline, and it happens to feel devastating precisely because the two claims share so much surface grammar. People sit with the first claim, feel the full weight of it, and then quietly, without meaning to, start living as though the second one were also true, which is a much colder and much less warranted place to end up. Iris asked, then, the question she had been carrying since the lecture hall, since the candle, since the walk home in the cold after the color talk. But if I can never get outside the mediation to check it, doesn't that mean the distinction between the two claims is itself unverifiable? How would I even know whether there's a real match underneath unconfirmable versus no match at all? The professor smiled at this, in the particular way of someone pleased that a question has arrived exactly on schedule, and said, right, and that's precisely why nobody gets to declare victory here. The healthy position, if there is one, isn't certainty in either direction. It's comfort with genuine, permanent not knowing, which is a much harder skill than picking a side. Most people can't stand the discomfort of true agnosticism for long, so they collapse it either into naive realism, pretending the mediation isn't there at all, or into a kind of nihilistic collapse, pretending the mediation proves nothing is there. Both of those are ways of escaping the discomfort rather than actually resolving the question, because the question, as far as anyone has ever been able to tell, doesn't resolve. It just has to be lived inside. Iris walked back to the train that afternoon, turning this over, feeling something in her chest loosen very slightly for the first time in weeks, not because any of her original questions had been answered, but because she had been handed, finally, a name for the shape of the problem, the difference between not being able to check and having checked and found nothing there, and having the name seemed to matter more than she would have guessed. It did not make the wall disappear. It made the wall feel, for the first time, like something she could stand in front of without needing to either tear it down or pretend it was a window. She started, in the 4th month, to notice a strange doubling in her daily life, a kind of permanent background hum underneath ordinary moments. She would be at work, in a meeting, watching a colleague gesture while making a point, and some small persistent thread of her attention would be elsewhere, thinking this whole scene, the fluorescent lights, the particular grey of the conference table, the sound of his voice, all of it is a phenomenal appearance constructed inside me, and I have no access whatsoever to whatever is generating it beneath the surface. It didn't stop her from nodding at the right moments, from contributing to the discussion, from behaving to any observer exactly like someone fully present. But something had shifted in how the moment fell from me inside, a faint translucency to things that hadn't been there before, as though she could almost see through the presented world to the machinery humming underneath it, the way you can sometimes, if you stare at a word long enough, feel it come loose from its meaning and become just a shape, strange and arbitrary, before it snapped back into sense again. There was one afternoon in particular she kept returning to, months later, as a kind of marker for how far the doubling had gone. A colleague, a man named Devon, who had never shown the slightest interest in anything Iris would have called philosophical, was describing a disagreement he'd had with his landlord about the color the hallway had been painted before he moved in. He insisted it had been a warm cream. The landlord insisted it had always been a cooler white, and neither of them could produce a photograph old enough to settle it. Iris found herself laughing along with the story, contributing the expected commiseration about landlords, and at the same time running underneath that ordinary social exchange like a second track of audio. A private thought arrived and would not leave, even if a photograph existed, even if it clearly showed one color rather than the other. It would only show what a camera's sensor had recorded of the wavelengths bouncing off that wall, converted through its own particular processing pipeline into a color value displayed on a screen and interpreted, once again, by two separate nervous systems that might not even agree with each other about what the displayed color looked like. There was, in the end, no neutral court of appeal, no view from nowhere either of them could stand in, only more and more layers of instrumentation stacked on top of the original disagreement, each layer itself just another kind of eye. She said none of this out loud to Devon, who would have found it reasonably an enormous overreaction to a story about hallway paint. She simply nodded, laughed at the right moments, and felt, for the length of that lunch break, the strange doubled sensation of participating fully in an ordinary human exchange, while a second, quieter version of herself watched the whole thing from a slight remove, cataloguing the mediation running underneath it like a technician monitoring a machine everyone else in the room had forgotten was there. She told Priya about the Devon conversation a few days later, expecting the same amused pushback she usually got, and instead found Priya more thoughtful than usual, turning her spoon slowly in an empty cup. "What strikes me," Priya said eventually, "is that you and Devon actually resolved the important part of the disagreement just fine, without ever touching the metaphysics. You both know what cream and white mean well enough to use the words usefully, to order paint, to describe a room to someone else over the phone, to notice when a wall needs repainting. The words work. They coordinate two separate minds around a shared project constantly, all day, every day, and they do it without either of you ever once needing to confirm that the inequality behind the words matches. Doesn't that suggest the coordination is the real achievement, and the unshareable inequality underneath it is almost beside the point, at least for most practical purposes?" Iris turned this over for a while, sitting across from Priya in the fading evening light before she answered. "I think that's true," she said slowly, "and I think it's also not quite the whole picture. The coordination is real, and it matters, and I don't want to talk myself out of how remarkable it is that two close private worlds can line up as well as they do most of the time, well enough to build cities together, raise children together, argue about paint together. But there's a difference between saying the inequality doesn't matter for coordination and saying it doesn't matter at all. If I found out tomorrow that everyone around me was a philosophical zombie, no inner light behind any of it, I don't think I'd feel that nothing had been lost. I think I'd feel that everything had been lost, even though not one single behavior in the room would have changed. The coordination would be exactly as good as it ever was. But something I care about, maybe the thing I care about most, wouldn't be there anymore, and the coordination alone wouldn't tell me it was gone. That's what unsettles me about the zombie thought experiments still, months after I first read it. Not that zombies are likely, just that the thing I most want to be true about the people I love, that there's someone actually home, that the inner light is actually on, turns out to be exactly the one thing that no amount of watching them, talking to them, coordinating with them, could ever confirm. Priya didn't have a quick answer for that, and for once didn't try to find one, and the two of them sat with it in a way Iris found she'd come to value more than resolution, not agreeing, not quite disagreeing, just letting the shape of the problem sit on the table between them a while longer, the way you'd let a difficult photograph sit face up without needing to decide immediately what it meant. It was around this same time that Iris noticed something had shifted in the way she related to other people's certainty, a change she hadn't set out to cultivate but noticed retroactively, the way you notice you've stopped biting your nails only once you catch yourself reaching for one and finding nothing to bite. She had always, before this year, found other people's confident pronouncements about reality faintly reassuring, the way her brother could say the tomato's red, whatever red ultimately means, and move on with his day, or the way a coworker could describe a memory from childhood with total unhesitating conviction, as though the memory were a photograph rather than a reconstruction rebuilt slightly differently every time it was recalled. She began to notice that same confidence in herself less often now, not because she had grown less capable of functioning. She still made decisions, still held opinions, still argued her side in meetings without hedging every sentence into oblivion, but because underneath the functioning she had stopped mistaking the felt sense of certainty for evidence of anything beyond itself. Certainty, she had come to suspect, was a mood as much as a judgment, a particular texture the mind produces under particular conditions, no more automatically tracking truth than warmth automatically tracked an actual fire nearby rather than a blanket, a memory, a fever. She did not think this made her a worse thinker. If anything, she thought it made her a slightly more honest one, willing to hold a position firmly enough to act on it while still remembering, somewhere underneath the acting, that the firmness was a feature of her mind's operation and not a direct readout of the world's actual structure. She noticed this shift most clearly, oddly enough, in small disagreements rather than large ones, not in arguments about philosophy, where she now expected uncertainty as a matter of course, but in ordinary disputes about which restaurant had better service last time, or whether a particular meeting had gone well or badly. She found herself more than once catching herself mid-sentence about to assert something as flatly obvious and pausing instead to notice that the flatness itself was just a feeling produced by a mind doing what minds do, not a stamp of approval from reality confirming she'd gotten it right. It made her, if anything, a slightly gentler arguer than she used to be, not because she had gone soft on her own views, but because she had stopped mistaking the intensity of her conviction for evidence that the other person was simply failing to see something she saw clearly. Sometimes they were, but sometimes she now suspected two people were simply two separate structured minds, each rendering its own version of a shared situation with equal internal confidence, and the disagreement between them was not a referee's call waiting to be made, but two phenomenal worlds failing, this once, to line up. She tried, one weekend, an experiment of her own devising, not scientific in any rigorous sense but personally significant. She sat in her apartment with the lights off except for a single candle, and she simply watched the flame for a long time, trying to notice moment by moment what was actually happening in her experience of it, trying to catch the seam between the flame itself and her perception of the flame, the way she'd learned to catch the seam at the edge of her blind spot. She could not do it. The flame simply appeared, warm and orange and flickering, exactly as immediate and undeniable as anything had ever felt to her, and no amount of careful attention allowed her to peel the appearance away from whatever it was an appearance of. This, she realized, sitting there in the dark with the candle guttering slightly in a draught she couldn't locate, was precisely the trap the whole inquiry kept describing. The mediation was not something you could catch happening the way you might catch a magician's hand moving if you watched closely enough. It was built into the very possibility of watching. There was no unmediated vantage point from which to observe the mediation occurring, because the observing itself was already inside it, all the way down, no exception, no gap, no seam to find, no matter how patiently or carefully she looked. And yet this was the thought that finally, weeks later, allowed something in her to settle, if not resolve. The flame had still been warm. Not warm as an unmediated metaphysical fact about the universe, perhaps, not warm the way the noumenon might or might not be warm in some sense she would never have access to, but warm as her experience, complete and vivid and undeniable in itself, whatever ultimately lay behind it. She began to wonder whether the entire unraveling of the past 4 months had actually been pointing her toward two separate discoveries that she had, for a long time, been collapsing into one. The first discovery was genuinely destabilizing and, as far as she could tell, permanent and irreversible, that she would never have unmediated access to whatever reality was, in itself, independent of the structuring, filtering, constructing mind she happened to be. That door really did seem to be closed, and closed for good, to her and to every human being who had ever lived, and probably to every possible mind of any kind that had ever tried to know anything about anything. The second discovery, though, the one she was still working out how to hold alongside the first, was that the mediated world, the phenomenal world, the world of shadows and constructed colors and filled in blind spots and privately textured qualia, was not therefore a lesser world, a fake world, a world to be mourned or escaped. It was simply the only world there had ever been for a creature like her, and calling it merely appearance implied a comparison to some realer alternative that no one, in the history of consciousness, had ever actually had. Perhaps the shadows on the wall were not a diminished substitute for the statues being carried behind the prisoners. Perhaps for the prisoners, the shadows simply were what seeing looked like, full stop, and the discovery that they were shadows of something did not make them less real experiences. It only revealed something true and slightly vertiginous about their source. She thought about this for a long time on a walk one evening in the 5th month, watching the sky do the specific violet orange thing it does just after sunset, a color she now knew was not strictly a property residing in the photons scattering through the upper atmosphere, but a joint production of that scattering and a visual system built by several 100 million years of evolutionary trial and error, tuned to notice exactly this kind of gradient because ancestors who noticed it, for whatever reason, tended to survive slightly better than ancestors who didn't. The sky was not lying to her, she thought. It also was not telling her the truth, not in any simple sense. It was doing something stranger, and once she stopped needing it to be one or the other more interesting, it was participating with her particular nervous system, her particular history, in the ongoing production of an experience that had never existed anywhere except at that exact meeting point between whatever the noumenon was doing up there and whatever her mind was built to do with it. The experience was real. It just wasn't unmediated. And she was starting to suspect, walking home in the gathering dark, that unmediated experience might not be a category anything had ever actually belonged to, not a paradise lost, but a concept that had never picked out anything at all, a shape with no objects, a word for a kind of contact no mind, human or otherwise, had ever been built to have. She still thought some nights about the brain in the vat, about the simulation argument, about whether the entire elaborate structure of her life, Priya, her brother, the coffee, the candle, the violet sky might be generated by something other than what it seemed to be generated by. She had not found, in 5 months of reading, a single argument that definitively closed off that possibility, and she suspected, with a kind of resigned clarity, that no argument ever would, because the possibility was constructed precisely so that no possible evidence could rule it out. What had changed was not her certainty about the answer. It was her relationship to the not knowing. She no longer expected the flaw to be there, underneath everything, solid and checkable. She had started, instead, to notice the specific texture of not having a flaw, the way you might, after enough time on a boat, stop bracing for solid ground and start noticing the actual motion of the water instead, finding in it a different, less certain, but not therefore lesser kind of steadiness. She noticed, too, that the fear itself had changed shape over the months in a way she hadn't expected when it first arrived. In the beginning, back when she'd first read about the vat and turned on every light in her apartment, the fear had been sharp and total, the kind that made her want an answer immediately, a way to rule the possibility out so she could go back to sleep. By the 5th month, the fear had softened into something closer to a familiar ache present most days in some low register but no longer capable of derailing an entire evening. She thought this softening was not the result of having found a counter-argument, because she hadn't. It seemed instead to be simply what happens to any thought, however vertiginous, once it had been sat with for long enough, not resolved but worn smooth, the way a stone in a river is not explained by the water but shaped by it patiently, without any single moment where the shaping could be said to have finished. There was a night near the end of that stretch when she tried to articulate all of this to herself in writing, sitting at her kitchen table with the same coffee ring-stained anthology open in front of her, now dog-eared and underlined in 3 different pens. She wrote that she had started the year assuming that the goal of all this reading was to arrive somewhere, a conclusion, a position, a settled answer to the question of whether she had ever really touched anything real. She wrote that she no longer believed that was the goal, or even that such a goal was available to a mind built the way hers was built. What she had arrived at instead, if arrival was even the right word for it, was something more like a posture, an ability to hold the mediation and the vividness together at the same time, without needing one to cancel the other out. The wall was still a wall. She still could not get behind it. But she had stopped experiencing that fact as an emergency and started experiencing it most days as simply a true and slightly strange description of what it is to be a mind at all, hers included, everyone's, always. Her brother visited again in the 6th month and asked, half joking, whether she'd resolved her whole is anything real thing yet. She said no, not really, and he laughed and said, well, at least the tomatoes still taste the same. And she said, actually, that's the one thing I'm more sure of than ever, not that the tomato is red in some absolute sense, not that my redness matches your redness, not that either of us has any access to whatever the tomato is doing when nobody's tasting it. Just that whatever this is, whatever is happening right now between me and the tomato and my nervous system and the sunset color of the peel, this, at least, is undeniably occurring. I don't know what's generating it. I don't know if there's a floor underneath it or shadows all the way down. But I know something is happening, right here, and it has a texture, and the texture is mine, whatever else turns out to be true or false about where it came from. Her brother sat with that for a while, turning his own mug of coffee in his hands the way he did when he was actually thinking rather than simply waiting for his turn to talk, and eventually said something that surprised her, coming from him. You know, he said, when I was in the hospital that time, after the accident, everything felt like that, hyper-present, weirdly textured, like I was noticing the actual quality of things for the first time in years, the sound of the machines, the specific blue of the curtain around the bed. I never called it philosophy. I just called it being scared enough to actually pay attention. Maybe that's what you've been doing this whole year, in a slower, less dramatic way. Iris found she didn't have anything clever to say back to that, and didn't try to. She just nodded, and they sat together for a while without talking, the way siblings sometimes can, and she thought that her brother, without ever having read a page of the philosophy she'd spent a year buried in, had perhaps landed on something true about the whole enterprise that none of the books had said quite so plainly, that all this inquiry into mediation and appearance and the impossibility of certainty had, in its own roundabout way, functioned as a discipline of attention, a forced slowing down that made the ordinary furniture of a life, coffee, siblings, a particular color of curtain, register as vivid and specific rather than passing by unexamined, the way most of a life is allowed to pass by unexamined precisely because it feels so reliably, unremarkably there. Her brother didn't really understand the philosophical details, and told her so, and she found she didn't mind because she was no longer entirely sure she needed anyone else to understand it in order for it to matter to her privately, in the specific and shareable way that all experience she had come to suspect was ultimately unshareable, passed between people only ever in the currency of words and gestures and behavior, the actual textures locked forever behind each person's own eyes, tasting each person's own tomato, warmed by each person's own private version of the color orange. It was a lonelier picture of the mind than she had started with 5 months earlier, standing at her kitchen window watching a delivery truck idle at the curb, thinking of nothing at all. But it was not, she had slowly come to feel, only a lonely picture. There was something almost tender in it too, the thought that every person she had ever met was walking around inside their own fully rendered, fully mediated world, invisible to everyone else, unprovable to everyone else, and yet somehow, against all that isolation, still managing to reach across the gap with words, with gestures, with the astonishing, imperfect, functioning agreement that let two separate closed worlds behave most of the time as though they were shared. In the final weeks of that year, she found herself returning, almost ritually, to the candle experiment, sitting in the dark with a single flame in front of her, not to catch the seam anymore. She had long since accepted that the seam could not be caught, but simply to notice what it was like to sit inside mediation on purpose, attentively, without flinching from it. She noticed that the flame still moved her the way it always had, that its particular orange, whatever its ultimate metaphysical status, still produced in her a small, specific calm she had felt around fire her whole life, long before she had any words for phenomenon or noumenon or qualia. She began to wonder whether the calm itself was a kind of answer not to the metaphysical question. That question, she now suspected, might never receive an answer, might not even be the kind of question capable of receiving one, but to a quieter, more practical question she had not realized she'd also been asking underneath all the rest, whether a mediated life could still be a full one. Sitting there, watching the flame do what flames had always done to her, she thought that it could. Not because the mediation had turned out to be an illusion after all, and not because she had found some trick to see around it, but because the fullness she was feeling had never actually depended on the mediation being absent in the first place. It had only ever depended on her attention, on her willingness to stay with what was in front of her instead of straining uselessly for some unreachable version of it standing behind. She thought, too, about something the professor had said almost as an afterthought, right as Iris was gathering her coat to leave that Thursday afternoon, something that hadn't seemed important in the moment but that had grown steadily more important in the months since. Iris had asked, half joking, whether the professor herself ever lay awake worrying about any of this, and the professor had laughed, not dismissively, and said that she used to badly as a graduate student to the point of genuine trouble sleeping, and that what eventually helped was not an argument at all but a kind of reframing of what philosophy was even for. She said she'd come to think of these deep structural puzzles, the gap between appearance and thing in itself, the privacy of qualia, the unfalsifiable, that not as problems to be solved, the way a crossword or an equation gets solved, but as permanent features of the landscape a reflective mind has to learn to live inside, the way a person living near the coast learns to live with tides rather than trying to argue the ocean into staying still. Some questions, she'd said, aren't obstacles on the way to an answer. They're just what it's like to be a certain kind of finite, structured thing, looking at itself looking. Iris had nodded at the time without fully absorbing it, distracted by the cold outside and the walk back to the train, but the phrase came back to her often afterward, usually late at night, usually right when the old vertigo threatened to return in full force, looking at itself looking. She thought there was something almost funny in it in the end, that the very post she'd been standing at all year, trying to see past her own seeing, was itself just one more instance of the pattern she'd been investigating, mind bending back on mind, forever unable to get behind its own activity to check it from outside. She was not looking at reality and separately wondering whether her looking was accurate. The wondering was itself just more looking, structured the same way, subject to the same limits, folded into the very thing it was trying to examine. There was no version of Iris standing outside Iris, auditing the process from a neutral chair. There was only ever more Iris further in. She noticed, too, that the professor's distinction, the one between not being able to verify a match and having verified its absence, had become something closer to a practice than a piece of information she'd once been handed. When the old vertigo returned, some evening still, standing at the sink or halfway through a meeting, she found she could name it now, quietly, to herself. This is the epistemological gap, not proof of absence, and the naming alone seemed to drain some of the panic out of the feeling, the way naming a physical pain to a doctor can make it, however slightly, easier to bear even before anything has been done about it. She did not think the gap would ever close. She had stopped expecting it to, but she had learned, slowly and without any single dramatic turning point she could point to live alongside it rather than either underneath it or in denial of it, the way a person who has learned to live near a fault line does not stop feeling the ground shift occasionally, but stops mistaking every tremor for the end of the house. She thought one last time of the prisoners in the cave and allowed herself a small revision of the story that she suspected the ancient philosopher had not quite intended but that felt true to her regardless. Perhaps the point was never really about escaping the cave for some final, ultimate outside, some last room with no further wall behind it. Perhaps every ascent simply led to a larger room, a wider set of shadows, a more sophisticated fire, sunlight itself being, after all, only ever encountered through an eye, a retina, a visual cortex, one more apparatus standing between the seer and whatever was ultimately being seen. And if that regress had no bottom, if it really was mediation nested inside mediation with no final unmediated floor to stand on, then the only sane response left, she thought, was not despair at the absence of a floor, but a kind of steady, clear-eyed attention to whatever room she currently happened to be standing in, this fire, this shadow, this particular slant of afternoon light through this particular window, real enough, vivid enough to build an entire life around, whether or not it was, in some final unreachable sense, the last room there was. She still did not know, some nights, whether the wall in front of her was made of shadows or of something that would, if she could ever manage to turn around, turn out to be the fire, or the walkway, or the sunlit world outside the cave's mouth, or nothing at all, no cave, no fire, no outside, just an endless corridor of caves nested one inside another, with no bottom floor and no exit anyone had ever found. What she knew, or thought she knew, or experienced with enough force that it functioned for her exactly the way knowing did, was that the wall was in front of her right now, vivid and warm and textured and undeniably present, and that whatever was casting it, she had spent this year, for the first time in her life, actually looking.